directly go on to the second topic. Now I invite Dr. Nishad, Associate Professor of Neonatology from JIPMER Puducherry, to present on his topic on case control studies and cohort studies. We welcome you, sir, for the research methodology workshop today.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir.
And you can see the slide, right?
Yes, sir, it's clear, sir.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. I think particularly I should thank Dr. Vishnu Bhatt, Director of Medical Research, for inviting me. We are going to talk about case control and cohort studies. So we are starting a few minutes late, but maybe we can finish on time still. We are all familiar with case control and cohort studies right from our days in preventive and social medicine. So first we'll briefly review what we already know about case control and cohort studies. Then we'll try to understand the concepts behind modern case control and cohort studies. And then we'll talk a little bit about matching and controls especially for case control study, and some of the common problems in these studies, including the biases. So what we know about these studies is that they are both analytic kind of studies and observational. So there is no intervention involved. They are not an experimental design. Case control and cohort studies both fall under observational study designs. Of course, both are analytic too. The problem with being observational is, of course, that a lot of biases can creep in. Unlike experimental studies where you have randomization to take care of a lot of confounders and some of the selection bias and other biases. So that much is common to both these study designs, but they're also very different. So what we know about case control study design from the past, from NVS days, is that we are looking at people with the outcome, and we are interested in studying the exposure. So we start the study with people who have the outcome, and we are going back and looking at their exposure status in the past. But in a prospective cohort study design, which is the classic cohort study, we are starting with people who have the exposure, and you start the study and you are following them up in time to see if they have the outcome of interest. Of course, there is also the retrospective cohort study design, which actually is quite similar in concept. The only difference is that the outcome has already occurred and you are starting the study after the outcome has occurred. But conceptually, it's the same. You are looking at the exposure from a database or from your case sheets, and then looking at the outcomes later. And that also maybe from the database or the case sheets or something like that. But the outcome has already occurred. You are doing this whole thing in retrospect. But conceptually, it's very similar to a prospective cohort study. And we will be spending a bit more time talking about case control studies, because case control studies are actually some of the most difficult study designs. And the concept is also a little hard to grasp. So what we know about classical case control study is something like this. You are starting the study. Let's say I'm interested in studying some rare outcome like cancer. So I take patients with cancer. So those will be the cases. I take patients without cancer. Those will be the controls. And then I look at some kind of exposure in both of them. Maybe I'm interested in smoking as the exposure. So I'm looking at the rate of smoking in people with cancer and the rate of smoking in people without cancer and comparing these two rates. So in other words, what I'm asking is there a difference in exposure or smoking between the group with cancer and the group without cancer? So this is what we understand classically by a case control study design. But the modern case control study design, what we call the contemporary case control, actually goes a little beyond this. And what it does is actually try to mimic the strengths of a cohort study using the concept of what we call the source population or the study base. So this is a very important concept in modern case control. So this is what helps us select appropriate controls, which is key to doing a good case control study. So when, let's say we have a research idea, so I've chosen a very simple example here, and it's from my field, but it's pretty simple. So I think you all should be able to understand it. Let's say I'm interested in finding out if prematurity is a risk factor for fungal sepsis in newborn babies. So here clearly the exposure is prematurity and the outcome is fungal sepsis. So if I have to do this study, I could do it as a case control. I could take babies with fungal sepsis and babies without fungal sepsis and look at their exposure status. That would be the case control design that we know. But like I said, modern case control studies try to maintain all the strengths of a cohort design. So we'll first imagine this as a cohort study design. So then the exposure comes first. In this case, the exposure we said is prematurity. So obviously you have the not exposed, that means term babies. And then you have the exposed, which means preterm babies. So let's say the term babies are the white circles and the preterm babies are the gray circles. And I'm admitting anybody who comes into the ICU. So the first baby that comes in just happens to be a term baby, so white circle, and I follow this baby up for say 4 weeks. Nothing happens, the baby does not have fungal sepsis, and the baby goes home. The second baby I enrolled just randomly happens to be a preterm baby. That baby, after a few days, after 2 weeks, say develops fungal sepsis. So that's our first case of fungal sepsis in this cohort. And I go on to enroll many more babies, let's say 20 babies. So on top, you can see the 20 numbers. They are the participants of the study. And the orange circles with numbers indicate the babies with fungal sepsis. So you can see baby number 2 developed fungal sepsis, baby number 8 developed fungal sepsis, baby number 13 developed fungal sepsis, and 15 also. These were all preterm babies. But one term baby, baby participant number 18, also developed sepsis. So altogether, it looks like 5 out of 20 babies, or around 25% of your study population, developed fungal sepsis. Of course, this is just an imaginary cohort. But you can see a few things here about the cohort study design already. One advantage, as you can see, is that you can obviously study multiple outcomes if you want. Exposure is only one, prematurity. But you can study outcomes other than fungal sepsis also. Maybe you can study mortality during this 4-week period, some other outcome that you're interested in, you can study all that. So you can study multiple outcomes. And you have, finally, like we said, 5 out of 20 developed this condition. So you have a measure of risk because you have both the numerator data and the denominator data. So this is the source population. These 20 babies that came into the NICU after you started the study was the source population. And out of them, 5 developed fungal sepsis. So this source population is something you can keep in mind in the next few slides when we talk about case control studies. So to summarize this, 4 of these babies who developed fungal sepsis were preterm babies. So the risk I can say is 4 by 10. And one of the babies was a term baby. So I can say the risk for term babies is about 1 by 10. And if I want, I can calculate a relative risk by dividing them, and I will get 4. 4 by 10 divided by 1 by 10 will be 4. So in layman's terms, to explain risk also, I can say that the risk for preterm babies developing fungal sepsis is 4 times higher when compared to term babies. So cohort study obviously has this advantage that you have the numerator and you also have the denominator, which actually happens to be the source population. And I can calculate risk, right? But now imagine that the same thing you were trying to do as a case control study. Now in case control study, we are enrolling the cases as they happen. So the first baby who develops fungal sepsis in the unit, I'll enroll as the first case. The second one develops fungal sepsis, I'll enroll as the second case, and so on. Maybe I enroll the same 5 babies as cases, but I don't have a source population here. I did not have any data on the source population. I only know about these 5 babies. Of course, we are only talking about the cases here. And now we also have to pick 5 babies as controls. And this is where things get tricky when you have to pick controls. And you also can see that risk cannot be calculated because the denominator data are missing. I don't know out of what source population these 5 cases came. So I have the numerator data for cases, but I don't have the denominator data. So I cannot calculate risk in a case control study design. So how do we select controls for this? We have the 5 cases, but how do we select controls? So this is the crux of case control study design. So ideally, what should happen is the controls should represent the source population. The controls are picked to represent the source population. And this is a very important concept in modern case control studies. And we'll come to that in one more slide. But this you can remember that the controls are representative of the source population. More specifically, they represent the exposure status similar to the source population. So for example, in this case, exposure was prematurity, and the ratio of preterm to term in the source population was 1:1. So control should also have approximately the same distribution of the exposure status. So the control should also be about half preterm and half term. In this case, we know the source population, but in real life, we often don't know the source population. So that makes it very tricky to select controls. Now, why is the case control study trying to be like a cohort study? So we already know that cohort study designs have many advantages, but imagine there is this village of 30,000 people, and there is a rare disease, let's say some kind of cancer, and that is happening in people who live beside the river and use it as their water source. Maybe it's a polluted river, it's a rare cancer. So let's say there are 10,000 people who use that water, and out of them 10 develop this cancer, right? So that means the total exposed is 10,000. Out of them, 10 people have developed the cancer. The not exposed people are another 20,000. Out of them, 5 have developed cancer. So like before, we can calculate the risk, relative risk. So you can say 10 out of 10,000 divided by 5 out of 20,000. So that gives us a relative risk of 4. But here, you have studied 30,000 people to get this relative risk. Now, suppose there is some way in which you can sample 1% of the people from the village and use them as controls, only 1% of the people. So that means around 300 people only. Out of 30,000 people, you randomly sample 300. So out of them, it is likely that around 100 will be exposed and around 200 will be unexposed because it's a truly random sample. Now, what you do in a case control study is you put them in the non-deceased column, not in the total column, in the non-deceased column. So the 100 and the 200 randomly picked people, the 300 randomly picked people are now in the non-deceased column. And you can calculate what we call the odds ratio in this. We don't have the total, so we cannot calculate the risk. But you can calculate the odds ratio by using this 100 and 200. And that will be 10 by 100. So the deceased divided by non-deceased is the odds. Divided by 5 by 200. And you again get 4. So you can see what you have done here is instead of following up 30,000 people, you have taken data on just more than 300 people. And you have come up with an odds ratio, a measure, which is very similar to the risk ratio you got from the cohort study. So if you select proper controls, you can actually get away with a much smaller sample, much shorter study duration, so much less expense, and still end up estimating the risk in the population, or at least a number that is very similar to that, if you do it correctly. Of course, these so controls have to be appropriately selected and they have to be representative of the source population. In this case, the exposed to non-exposed ratio is similar in both this case control example and the cohort example. It's about 1:2. So that's the key concept. The exposure status of the controls should match that of the source population. If you can do that, a case control study is almost as good as a cohort study. And that's why we were talking about the cohort study design earlier. So to understand the strength of the cohort study and to see how the case control study in modern times is trying to imitate that. But that said, the odds ratio is not exactly the relative risk. And you have to be a bit careful when you're interpreting it. Relative risk is, of course, more intuitive. Like we said, 3 times higher risk or double the risk or half the risk. And people can easily understand it. Odds ratios are a bit harder to figure out in your head. So people may not always understand it very intuitively. And it's, of course, not really equivalent. So generally speaking, odds ratios tend to show a stronger association. So it may overestimate the association usually. But there is something called the rare disease assumption. So if your outcome is very rare or the disease is very rare, the odds ratio tends to be very close to the relative risk. So you can think of them somewhat similarly. And of course, statistically, one advantage is that the output of the logistic regression directly can give you the odds ratio, because there you are modeling the odds of the logit. So in medicine, we often use logistic regression and we use a lot of binary outcomes. So this is another major advantage of odds ratio. So how do you pick these controls then? So in practice, very often the population-based controls may not be feasible. In population-based controls, of course, means sample from the general population. Let's say all your cancer patients are from this particular district, and you can take a random sample from that general population. That may be not always feasible. For one, the general population tends to be very large. Second, the cases may be in a particular age group or so, and getting all the people of that specific age group from the population may not always be feasible, and then taking a random sample out of it. So this is not always feasible, but this would be ideal. So very often it's case-based. You enroll a case and you enroll someone from the neighborhood, from the locality, or from among the friends, and so on. Very often case control studies done for thesis or other research purposes in hospital-based studies, they are often using controls from patients with other conditions. So I may be looking at patients with cancer, but the controls may be drawn from the asthma clinic or some other OPD, where we think the people are similar to the source population. At the very least, if you are using hospital-based controls, you should ask yourself, would these patients have come to me if they had this particular kind of cancer? Would they have come to my hospital? Because the cases did come to your hospital from the source population. So if the answer is no, they would have probably gone to Chennai, then they are probably not appropriate controls for your cases. So you have to figure this out. There is no single answer to how to select controls. I'm going to skip this slide because it's a harder example. Let's say you are studying the association of smoking with cancer, some cancer. So lung cancer or some other cancer. Now the student asks you, can the controls be adults from the COLD ward, like adults with emphysema or something like that? Now I would think about this, and I know the exposure is smoking in this case. So like we said, the exposure status of the controls, or in other words, the smoking status of the controls should match that of the source population, right? Do you think the smoking status of adults with emphysema will match that of the source population? That sounds unlikely, because smoking is probably more common among people with emphysema because it's also a risk factor for emphysema. So they probably won't be appropriate controls. So this is how you go thinking about it. But in practice, selecting controls is very, very difficult. So usually it's good to, if you are planning a project which is a case control study, usually good to have someone with experience guide you at least the first time or the first few times. So briefly about confounders, because this will come up in the discussion of various study designs. You already know that a confounder is something that's associated with exposure and with outcome, and is also an independent risk factor for the outcome. So let's say we are looking at the association between smoking and esophageal cancer. Alcohol could be a confounder, because alcohol intake may be associated with smoking, and it's also associated with esophageal cancer because it's an independent risk factor for the esophageal cancer. If you don't take into account this alcohol consumption, you may think that a lot of the risk is due to smoking, when actually smokers may be taking more alcohol also, and that may be contributing to some of the esophageal cancer. So you may overestimate the risk of smoking causing esophageal cancer. So this is a confounder, very simple terms. And we have to somehow address confounding in all these observational studies. In a randomized control trial, randomization takes care of a lot of these issues. It will take care of most of the known and unknown confounders. But these are observational studies, so confounding is always going to be a problem. In general, other than randomization, there are 3 or 4 ways in which you can reduce confounding. One is restriction. So if I think prematurity is a confounder, I can study only term babies. Or if I think booking status is a confounder, I can study only booked women. So it depends on, but you should remember that if you restrict study to some population, the results will be applicable only to that population. So you basically will, and if you restrict too many things, your study will only be applicable to a very limited population. So its relevance may be decreased. Another way is matching. So controls, for example, can be matched or unmatched. And this is anyway something that we'll talk about later. A third thing is stratification. So you would have very often seen this is done in randomized control trials also often. You stratify patients by age or weight category, or in neonatology by gestational age category, or by parity, women categorized by parity. And you, let's say you're doing a randomized control trial, you will be randomizing those strata separately. So if you have 2 strata, each strata will have a new randomization list. But this stratification can also be done in case control studies or other study designs. And that will take care of some of the confounding. These are all, of course, in the design phase itself, you can do this. But suppose there is still some residual confounding, at the analysis stage, you can do some kind of multivariable analysis, like logistic regression, for example, or linear regression for continuous outcomes. You can do that and take care of some of the confounding in the statistical analysis part. That is less ideal than controlling for confounding in design stage, but that's something we can do. In general, we take controls for cases. Very often we take matched controls. Simplest form will be pair matching. One case, you pick one control, but you can also use more than one control per case. And the advantage here is that it reduces the number of cases you need. But of course, it will increase the total participant numbers. And this is basically, if the case is very rare, let's say this cancer is very rare, and you want to reduce the cases, at least by a little, you may take more than 1:1 control. So you may take sometimes 2 controls or 3 controls. Generally speaking, more than 3 or 4 controls per case, there is no statistical benefit. So very rare to see more than 3 or 4 controls per case. So let's say you have 10 cases, you may need 10 controls if you're doing 1:1. So you have total of 20 participants. But suppose this cancer is very rare and you're only able to get 8, maybe you can take something like 1:2. So in this case, now you need only 8 cases, but 16 controls. So the statistically it has the same power, let's say. I mean, this is not exactly accurate, but this is the concept. But now you have a total number of participants is 24. So your study expense may be more, especially if you have to do some expensive blood tests like genetic testing and all that. So you have to consider that the total participants will increase, but the number of cases required will be less if you take more controls. And we take matched controls very often, matched for some kind of factor that you think is a very important confounder that you need to match for. But matching can sometimes introduce confounding, and I'll give you an example. Let's say I have these 8 cases of cancer, and I'm comparing them to 8 participants without cancer. And I'm looking at some exposure. Let's say I'm looking at smoking, but I take controls matched for sex. So for each male cancer patient that I enroll a male patient without cancer. And for each female patient with cancer, I enroll a female patient without cancer. Now what happens here is you have matched for sex, your exposure is smoking. But smoking just happens to be very closely correlated with male sex. So indirectly, you may end up matching for smoking also. Although you haven't matched for smoking, you have indirectly matched it because, and you ended up with 4 smokers and 4 non-smokers in both the groups. So you may find no difference. This is an example of negative confounding where there is actually an effect of smoking on this cancer, but you did not find it because you matched for one other variable, which actually, affected the distribution of your exposure, in this case, smoking. So when you match, you have to be careful to see that that matched variable is not very strongly at least associated with the exposure. Otherwise, you may end up matching for the exposure and you won't find any difference. So that's matching, generally speaking, will ensure comparability of the groups, but it can, like we said, add some kind of confounding. And it is, especially if you want to do 1:3 or 1:4 matching, it can sometimes be very hard to find controls also. Finding controls is also not easy. Finding cases may be harder, but controls are also difficult and it may add to the expense of it. Now, one major problem in these case control studies will, for example, be a selection bias. Actually, that is a problem in many study designs, and there are different ways to overcome it. Randomization, for example, to some extent, and location concealment, for example, will control for it in randomized control trials. But here there is no such thing. So the selection bias is always going to be a problem. So, for example, if I'm doing the study here, the poor patients may be more likely to give consent, but then that may be one of the key risk factors that you're studying. So the poor patients may actually be overrepresented in my data when compared to another institution, let's say a private institution. Ideally, you should pick all the cases from a source population, like all cases of cancer from the source population, but for feasibility reasons, that always is not possible. It may be too expensive or not feasible otherwise to do it. Then there is always the bias in measuring the exposure, because I'm always in a case control study, you're always asking about things retrospectively. So if I know, for example, that this patient already has cancer, I will ask him more carefully. If he says, no, I did not smoke, I may ask, are you sure? Maybe you smoked at least once or twice. Maybe when you're doing MBBS, you smoked and you have forgotten about it by now. So I may, try to find out more about smoking if I know the patient has cancer. So that is called an interviewer bias. So you can, to some extent, overcome it by blinding the interviewer to the outcome by using standard proformas. If a blood test is possible, instead of the interview, do that, because that is very hard to bias, right? But that's not always possible, and there can always be some interviewer bias. And then there is the recall bias. That's an important bias in case control studies. If I'm looking at students who failed in the MBBS exam and I'm doing a case control study of those students, the students who failed actually may be more likely to recall some unpleasant exposures during their MBBS period, like confrontations with teachers, for example. So how do you overcome that? You can try to look for sources, other sources, like you ask the parents, or if it's some other outcome, you may be asking the spouse instead of just asking the patient, or you may be going through medical records which are more objective. So there are ways to do it, but there will always be some bias creeping in all these study designs. Now, we did not talk about one particular study design, which is actually, we did talk about this study design, but we did not specifically mention it as such. This is probably one of the strongest case control study designs, what we call a nested case control. So let's say you did this cohort study and you had these 5 cases of fungal sepsis. Now, this is one situation where you have the entire source population and data on the entire source population. So what you could do is take these 5 cases and take controls from the remaining population and do the study, because now you have the complete data on the source population, you know the source population. So that when you do a case control study within a cohort study design, within a prospective cohort study design, or you can do it within a retrospective also, but more commonly during a large prospective cohort study, we do a nested case control study also. It's a very strong case control design. And why would you do that? Because sometimes we need to do, for example, genetic tests like whole exome sequencing, and that costs many thousands or tens of thousands of rupees. So you may not be able to do it for the whole cohort of thousands of people or hundreds of people. So you will do a nested case control within and try to do it for at least a few people. And this study design will be almost as strong as a cohort because you know entirely about the source population. So very common case control study design. So in summary, these are the advantages and disadvantages of case control studies. Case control studies are quick, they are inexpensive, you have fewer participants, they are good for rare outcomes because you are starting with patients with the outcome. You can study multiple exposures, you can't study multiple outcomes, but you can study multiple exposures. This is good if you have a long induction period or latency, because if you're doing a cohort study, you will have to follow them up for a very long time for them to develop cancer, for example. So it will become very expensive. So this is good. But the disadvantage is you can have all kinds of recall bias and selection bias. You cannot calculate the incidence, for example, or the risk. They're not suited to study multiple outcomes, and they are not appropriate for rare exposures. They are suitable for rare outcomes, but not for rare exposures. So that's a summary of it. One other thing I wanted to add is, although we say that case control studies are retrospective, we enroll patients prospectively. So the first case of fungal sepsis occurs today, I may enroll that patient today. The second case may occur after a few days, I will enroll that patient later. So enrollment is prospective, although we are enrolling them after the outcome occurred and we are collecting the data on exposure retrospectively. Right? So incident cases, that is prospective enrollment, is preferred. Source population is a key concept. The control should represent the source population, and there is a different kind of analysis if you are using matched controls for the study. But I think you have another whole session, you have whole sessions on statistics later. And now we'll briefly talk about cohort studies, because we already did talk about a major kind of cohort study, which is the closed cohort. Like for example, if I'm studying people, let's say Bhopal gas tragedy, it's a limited number of people. They are not going to change over time, and I can follow them up and see for some outcome, let's say some kind of cancer. And the number of people in the study, we can only decrease over time. It cannot increase over time. It cannot change otherwise over time. It can decrease because people may drop out of the study, or people may develop the cancer and have the outcome of interest. So then there'll be fewer and fewer people in the study. This is a common study design. It's a closed cohort study. And like we said, you can estimate the risk and all that. But there is a different cohort study design, like you might have heard about the Framingham cohort, which is probably the most famous cohort study design. That is an open cohort. So the subjects here enter and leave at different times. So let's say I enroll a patient. I follow that patient up for a few years or months or weeks. But the second patient I enrolled was only in the study for a little bit before the patient developed the outcome. The third patient was enrolled later and was lost to follow-up or died. A fourth patient may have completed a long duration, a full study duration. A fifth patient only completed a partial duration before they moved out of town or something like that. So this is a study design where subjects are entering and leaving at different times. So you can't just use the denominator as the number of people, because each person is contributing a different amount of time to the study. So in this case, we will use the person time as the denominator. So this is one major difference as opposed to a closed cohort study design. Anyway, this is also a very important study design. So where different people contribute different time periods to the study. And you can do matching in cohort studies also, but it is less commonly done and it can be difficult. You can control for confounders to some extent by matching also. But then you are studying multiple outcomes, and the kind of matching that is required for different outcomes may be different. So it is a little harder to do it. And in general, we used to look at time person units, not people are not the denominator. So matching becomes a little harder. The, of course, problem with cohort study designs is the follow-up. You generally need a large number of participants, and some studies last decades, like the Framingham cohort study has lasted. And if you lose people to follow up, it can reduce the power of your study. And if some kind of people are preferentially leaving the study in follow-up, like for example, if I'm following up children and children with bad outcomes don't come back because they lose faith in my treatment, then I will wrongly estimate the prevalence of some outcome, right? The incidence of some outcome, because I don't see them coming back. I think these things are not happening, but they're happening. They're not coming back because it's happening, and they don't trust me anymore to treat them correctly, right? So that can actually lead to a bias in the estimate also. So you have to try and minimize loss to follow-up. This is a very important part of cohort study designs. And this is what the research team needs a lot of training for. There are usually, right now we have, for example, 2 or 3 multi-site cohort studies going on in the unit. And one of the major issues is follow-up. And it's a very difficult issue. There are a lot of phone calls to be made, a lot of training of the personnel involved to be, able to follow them up correctly, and to even before enrolling them, you may be able to assess compliance of the parents or the patients. And you need to collect at least 2 phone numbers, complete address, contact information to be able to contact them later. There should be good rapport between the research staff so that people are encouraged to come back and follow up. Some non-financial incentives may help. Sometimes we give, toys to the children, or educational material to the parents, or like height measurement tools for parents and things like that. So that is also encourages people to come back. But again, you can have selection bias. There is often, for example, healthy people who are more likely to accept invitation to participate in studies. That is called a healthy participant bias. The cohort is generally healthier than the whole population. And this is sometimes due to your enrollment criteria also. I may say, for example, that I won't include children with shock, or I won't include children with congenital malformations. So my population tends to be healthier than the general population. So it introduces a bias. And then, like we said, loss to follow-up bias also. And then there is always information bias. If I knew this guy was a smoker, I may look more carefully for features of cancer. I may do more tests and so on. So that's another kind of bias that can creep in. So, of course, the advantages are the temporal sequence is clear. Like we saw in fungal sepsis, you know that you started with prematurity and you can see fungal sepsis developing later. So that time sequence is very clear. That is very important for establishing causation. As you know, the exposure has to come before the outcome. You can calculate incidence, you can study multiple outcomes, and it's good for rare exposures, but not good for rare outcomes. So on the downside, you have a very large study, expensive, time consuming, and there are different kinds of biases involved, like the diagnostic suspicion bias that we talked about. So they both have their own advantages and disadvantages, cohort and case control designs. To summarize cohort studies, they are can be closed or open. The advantage is, of course, that you can estimate an incidence and a risk ratio. But of course, they are not good for rare outcomes or if the latency is very long. And but of course, the challenges are more subjects, and you need a longer duration of study also. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful presentation. You have clearly explained what is the case control study and the cohort, the advantages and the limitations of it. And the participants, if you have got any queries, add it to the chat box. We don't find any. Sir, we have one question, sir. Can you explain about representative sample?
That has more to do with sampling. So, but in general, that is true for any sample. that sample has to be representative of the population you are studying. I mean, it is not specific to case control or cohort study designs.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think anyway that will be covered in statistics also. Like, how can you make sure that the sample is representative of the population you are trying to study? But is there any other question?
We have one more question, sir. In hybrid model like nested case control study, analysis tends towards
Yeah, I can see that. Analysis tends towards relative risk or odds
risk
ratio.
or odds. Risk.
Yeah. So you estimate only the odds ratio, but the odds ratio in this case will be somewhat closer to the relative risk. So it is always the odds ratio in a case control study. But the strength of the nested case control study, because you have complete data on the source population, what it means is that that odds ratio you are getting from it will be very close to the relative risk which you would have estimated if you had done it as a cohort study. And of course, you can do it at just a fraction of the cost.
Thank you, sir.